Hi, I hope you've enjoyed our COP29 special series so far. Today I want to jump in here just to bring you some updates on the convention itself. COP29 is now in full swing in Baku, Azerbaijan. And COP meetings like this one normally lay the groundwork for how nations tackle climate challenges and also shape energy policies and climate actions across the globe. At the opening of COP29, UN Climate Secretary Simon Steele highlighted the goal for them in Baku this time.
We must agree a new global climate finance goal.
A finance agreement basically means some countries will fund climate actions in others. Professor Teng Fei, who is a climate and energy expert from Tsinghua University, notes a similar target was actually set in Paris 9 years ago.
Clearly from this convention that it should be the developed countries who pay for this so-called incremental cost for mitigation action taken by developing countries. And that is because of the historical responsibility of developed countries. They emit most of the historical emissions which has accumulated in the atmosphere. And I think the Paris Agreement makes this also very clear. The developed countries has the commitment that to provide up to $100 billion up to 2020.
Then why is the UN asking for more money now? I'm Fei Fei, and this is Climate Watch, the podcast where we break down the big climate questions with insights from experts and industry insiders. My hope is to give you a better understanding of our planet and inspire you to take actions, big or small. I had the chance to talk with Professor Teng Fei. He was catching a midnight flight from Beijing to Baku. He was really kind to take the time with me a few hours before his flight and discuss financial gap between developed and developing nations in this climate crisis. We also dove into another hot topic at COP29, the carbon market, which is starting to look a lot like the next big global marketplace like the stock markets. Our conversation took place on Tuesday, November the 12th. $100 billion by the year 2020, which was 4 years ago. And so have the developed countries pay the money to the developing countries?
Well, I have to see, it depends on what will be the scope, means how to labor a climate finance. There is no agreement between developed countries and developing countries on the scope of those climate finance. Although based on the self-reports from OECD countries or from the rich countries, they achieved this 100 billion goals last year. But there are several issues need to be mentioned. I think firstly, as I have discussed, the scope is quite different. The developing countries wish most of the money should grant or concessional funding, but in fact it is not. Most of the current funding are not grant. They are generally the loans, although with some concessional interests. And second one issue is we should make this quite clear is the $1 today is not $1 decades ago. The 100 billion agreement was achieved in 2009 in Copenhagen. But if you look at the recent trends of inflation, in fact, if we translate this $100 billion today into the equivalent real dollars in 2009, it's something like less than $70 billion. So the inflation has eroded those $100 billion commitment time by time.
So the money that's paid by the rich countries are in the form of loans, which basically means the poorer or underdeveloped countries will need to pay back some of the money over some period of time. It's more of a debt, really. And then at the same time, as you mentioned about the inflation, so we are seeing these divergence between what we call global north and global south, with the north being the rich ones and the south being underdeveloped ones. Do you think the global north will step up their ambition and commit more money in this COP?
I'm not very optimistic and probably some pessimistic at this moment. We didn't see any political signal or political momentum at this COP that to mobilize or to even suggest quantified numbers. The number is not there. If we want those rich countries to raise a number that requires a substantial political mobilization, for example, if we recall back what happens in 2009 when the $100 billion goal was raised, there are a lot of political endorsement from developed countries, firstly from the UK. The UK Prime Minister Gordon Brown mentioned this $100 billion based on a study by the very famous economist Nixon from the London School of Economics. And then this $100 billion numbers was also endorsed by the United States Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at that moment. Most importantly, those numbers was also accepted by the developing country leaders in that COP. So you can see that if you want to raise such numbers, you need a lot of political support at a high level. But at this moment, I didn't see any signal from the rich countries. There is no numbers. There is almost no leaders from key rich countries to came this COP.
Since you mentioned about the political endorsement, and apparently one of the big players in this climate crisis is definitely the United States. The new president-elect Donald Trump will come into office next year. But this time, the delegation from the US are actually sent by Joe Biden. And so do you think we can see any constructive commitments from the US this time? Or if they made those commitments, how likely are they going to be put into practice?
Well, in fact, this is not new. We experienced this about 8 years ago when President Trump came into the office for his first term. I think basically what we can see from the experience of first term of Trump president, he is definitely a climate denier. So he has no interest to invest in climate actions even within the United States. And also he has no interest to support other developing countries in terms of climate finance. So what we can see is basically United States need to go back to the climate action at local level, at state level, and that will substantially undermining the ambitions of climate action in the United States, as well as it will also has huge impact on the actions in other countries, especially developing countries, because of some so-called umbrella countries, which means Japan, Australia, Canada, and so on and so forth, will basically follow the energy policy and climate policy of the United States. So there is probably spillover effects of the change of United States climate policy. And also the United States probably also have the impacts on the European Union's climate ambitions because of its foreign policy will change the policy priority in European Union, and the climate agenda probably will have a lower rank in the next few years, even in the European Union. So from those various perspectives, we have to be ready for a climate world without the United States at least for the next 4 years.
Is there another way out if, for example, the United States or even the EU or some other umbrella nations that you mentioned started to stepping back on their climate-related policies? What are other solutions that are feasible in your eyes?
I think compared with the first term of President Trump, probably one thing is during the Biden administration, the United States passed several climate-related acts, including the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and other acts. So it will be a little bit difficult for President Trump to withdraw from those acts which have been passed in the Congress in the United States. And because of another hope probably came from Elon Musk, that who worked closely with Donald Trump at this moment. And Elon Musk is a person that who favor of these electric vehicles as well as those renewable energy. So probably it will be different a little bit with his first term, but who knows? We have to wait and see. And for other possible way out, I think that probably the European Union should consider carefully that how to work with China and other developing countries to close the gap, which United States probably withdraw from both Paris Agreement and even withdraw from the United Nations Framework Convention. I think that European Union should carefully consider is CBAM, these carbon tariff matters, which prevent global cooperation regarding to the renewable energy in the future. Probably that we should consider to enhance the global supply chain for renewable energy and to identify possible approach to further reduce the cost of those renewable energies. And the reduction of the renewable energies will accelerate the global deployment of low carbon technology, and that will help us probably identify a way out. But unfortunately, it seems the world is not towards that direction. Most of rich countries consider to use tariffs or other unilateral measures to prevent this global cooperation. So probably that is the time that we should consider carefully what will be our future.
That's very interesting. I think a lot of the experts and also world leaders agree that tackling of this climate crisis, we need international cooperation. Then how come for big players like the European Union are stepping up on measures such as tariffs, sort of steering towards protectionism? How come they are choosing this path?
Well, I think basically it's a political decision for European Union or for other countries to consider these matters of carbon tariff. Basically, the European Union would like to pursue an ambitious target within European Union, but they have to persuade the energy-intensive industries within their border that to bring them on board. But those interest groups have a lot of lobbying power, so they basically bargain with the European Union to say that if you want us on board, you need to impose a carbon tariff and to protect our interests. And that is basically this political decision that the European Union decided to impose a carbon tariff. But unfortunately, this is not good for the global mitigation. That is also not good for the developing countries because basically that is a matter shift the burden from rich country to poor nations. And that is not matters which can deliver the global mitigation efforts.
Then in this perspective, what position should China stand?
Well, I think that for China, my perspective is the key issues is how we can work together to reduce the cost of low carbon technology as soon as possible, as much as possible. I think this is the key. So we should take every measure that to achieve these goals, which includes that we should remove those trade barriers related to low carbon technology instead of to use the tariff as a new barrier. And we should work along the supply chain that to share the technology as well as to share the IPR that to accelerate the innovation. And we should open the market and to establish a competitive market and to bring the cost down. I see this is one of the priority approach that China consider it is possible and it is appropriate and it is also reachable through global cooperation.
before the Chinese delegation departed for Baku, they actually released a report reviewing all the strategies and plans addressing climate change, and which includes what you mentioned, for example, with the carbon market. Actually, it's a quite confusing segment of the report, not only because of the terminologies, but also the fact that the market is designed to calculate every bit of carbon we emit. I'm really curious on a personal level, is that possible? How can we, include every carbon we emit and put a price on it, and then we can trade on something like a stock market? And how is that going to help us to mitigate global warming and also even maybe slow down global warming?
I think firstly, the carbon market is a market mechanism that to identify the least cost mitigation options to help us that to reduce our greenhouse gas emission. So the basic approach of this carbon market is firstly we need to measure how much we have emitted for each entity in the market, which means each company, right? So we need a very careful reporting, measurement, and verification, which means 1 ton is 1 ton. So when you report you emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide in the market, you really emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide, which means your data must be accurate. And based on this accurate data, basically in the market, each firms will be given an so-called allowance, which means how much you are allowed that to emit. At the end of the day, the company need to compare its real emission with its allowance in the hand. If they have more emission compared with the allowance, they need to buy the permits from the market that to make sure that their emission is 100% equal to their allowance. But if they emit less compared with their allowance, they can sell those allowance that to earn money from the market. So you can see that for one company, if there is a carbon price in the market, they will consider what will be the cost for reduce the carbon dioxide within their company. If the cost is much lower than the price, they will prefer to reduce those emissions and earn additional allowance and sell those allowance to the market to earn the profit. So that is basically the methodology or the mechanism that to identify the least cost approach through the market that to achieve a given carbon emission cap.
So you mentioned the mechanism is based on the company's own reporting. What if they lied in their reports?
There is third party called verification process that to make sure 1 ton is 1 ton, just like the auditing company in the stock market to make sure that the financial report from each company is real. There is no cheating.
So China has been trialing on the carbon market for a few years now. And how would you evaluate in different cities and provinces how the progress in establishing a national or even international carbon market?
Well, in fact, China right now has started its national market, and Chinese market is the largest carbon market in the world. European Union is the second in terms of its emission covered by the market. Right now, for the Chinese market, only the electric sector is covered, but China is planning to expand this market to cover other energy-intensive industries, for example, the iron steel, cement, the aluminum, as well as the chemical, and so on and so forth in the next step. So once China covers all of those carbon-intensive industries, generally over 70% of China's greenhouse gas emission will be covered within this market. So that's in terms of its coverage. And if we look at those carbon price, we see that when China started its national market 2 years ago, And the carbon price is roughly 50 RMB per ton of carbon dioxide. But the carbon price has reached to about 100 RMB per tons of carbon dioxide. So from that price signal, you also can see that the Chinese carbon market makes substantial achievement in terms of both the coverage and its price signal. And we can imagine that in the next step, once China expands its coverage of the market, and we will see the price signal will take its function and it will direct the mitigation action in China and to achieve China's emission target with high efficiency and least cost.
At the same time, I think it's very controversial for the EU's decision to implement that tariff. So do you think it is because of the carbon market is really profitable, so the EU is sort of protecting their own entities and companies?
Well, I think that firstly, that from the global perspective, that if we want to achieve globally least cost mitigation, we need to connect all the national market and to form a global market, because that is how the least cost mitigation option can happen, right? But unfortunately, that because of the carbon price is quite different from country to country. For example, that I mentioned in China right now, the carbon price is generally 100 RMB per tons of carbon dioxide, which is equivalent to something like 12 or 13 euro per ton of carbon dioxide. But the carbon price in EU ETS right now probably something like 80 euros, so much higher than Chinese carbon price. So there is a lot of concern from European Union that if they connect the European Union market with Chinese market, then a lot of allowance from or a lot of credit from Chinese market will flooding the European market. So that is basically the concern. But I do believe those concerns can be resolved. I think that we can design methods that to prevent or to control those happens. For example, that we can limit the amount of the allowance which can flow from Chinese market to the European market. So we benefit from the linkage between different national market, but still prevent those kind of possible flooding of the credit from one market to another. So basically, I do believe that one of the key future policy direction is we should consider how to link those various national markets together and to benefit from this linkage and to lower the mitigation cost for all the countries.
So far in this episode, we've been talking about the big emitters, China, European Union, the United States. I can't help but thinking about smaller countries. Can they also participate in some form in this seemingly profitable carbon market? Is there also part of the discussion at this COP as well?
Well, I think this COP will talk about one very important article in the Paris Agreement, which is called Article 6, which is basically regarding to the international carbon market. But for small countries, I think it really depends on their domestic policy decision that whether or not they prefer a carbon market policy or otherwise a carbon tax policy, which means to impose a price directly on the emission instead of to trading those credits through the market. Because of big emitters, European Union or United States who prefer the carbon market is largely due to a political reason because of the tax. Even the carbon tax is a poison for the election. Once a politician raises a tax, the voters are not preferable to that candidate because of they believe that they will pay for those tax. So basically, they change to the carbon trading, which seems will not impose additional tax on the household. But in fact, they are equivalent in terms of the theory, but it's much more safer from a political point of view. But for smaller countries, if they do not have those concerns, probably the carbon tax will be a better alternative.
So a carbon tax, in theory, could be easier to implement compared with a carbon market?
I think it depends. Firstly, that the carbon tax, generally, I think the transaction cost for carbon tax will be a little bit lower because of what you did is, in fact, for example, you can calculate the carbon content in the coal, oil, or gas, those fossil fuels, and then you can impose those carbon tax on those price of fossil fuels, just like the fuel tax in the gasoline. So it will basically do not need a huge efforts to build a market, to monitor the emissions of thousands of companies, and to ask the third party to verify those emissions and to treat those emissions as well. But in another hand, I mean, the political consideration is also a concern because of if we want to achieve the carbon neutrality in 2050, we need to reach those level of tax over time. But sometimes it's not very easy for the country to pass a legislation that will increase tax over time. But it will be politically easier that for a carbon market that to reduce its cap over time. So it's really that is a balance between its economic efficiency as well as its political acceptability.
So all this building up a carbon market or implementing a carbon tax, well, the goal is the same, is to try to limit our warming. And according to the Paris Agreement, it should be 1.5 degrees C, above pre-industrial levels. Can we reach that goal, or have we missed the window to limit or mitigate the climate crisis?
Well, first, I think that there are two temperature goals in the Paris Agreement. One is 1.5, another is 2 degrees. But according to the recent research, if we take into consideration of the commitment have been announced by all countries, including those carbon neutrality goals from various countries, we basically can achieve 1.7 degree goals instead of 1.5 degree goals.
So still hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, from that perspective. But we also need to mention that there is a so-called implementation gap, which means although if we can achieve what we have committed, we will have a 1.7 degree. But the current policy we have announced will not bring us to our commitment. So we still need to do more to fulfill our commitment. So there are two gaps. One is the so-called ambition gap, which is the difference between our commitment with the temperature goal. Another is implementation gap, which means what we have done, the difference between what we have done and what we have committed. So basically, if we take into consideration of what we have committed, that is something like 3 degree world or 2.5 degree world. I'm not quite sure about the exact number, but that is the case.
Still pretty hefty, pretty high.
Yeah.
About implementation, that's what the COP meetings have been talking about. We hear a lot about debates and negotiation coming from these climate change conferences. So do you think the climate change conference has played its due part?
Well, to answer this question, we need to recall what has been experienced that in previous COP. I do believe that the climate negotiation process largely plays the role that in collecting various countries that to form a firm position that to cope with climate change. Firstly, because of this task is very challenging. It is not easy, that we need to have agreements among more than 180 countries. They have different national interests, they have different national priority, they have different national policy agenda. So it's quite challenging, difficult to bring them together to agree on one thing. But we did. We did this several times to agree on this United Nations Climate Change Convention about 30 years ago, and we agree on Kyoto Protocol about 20 years ago, and we also agreed on this Paris Agreement about 10 years ago. So it delivers, but at the same time that it is also very challenging because of its decision-making rules. That the decision-making rules in the climate negotiations is this so-called consensus, which means if this conference wants to make a decision, we need every country on board. And because of these consensus-based rules, it's quite challenging. You have to make a very hard decision. On one hand is the so-called efficiency, which means how fast you can go. And on another side is the inclusion, which means how many you want to bring on board. For this negotiation process at this moment, the policy choice is we want all countries on board. So because of this, you have to sacrifice a little bit on the efficiency part. That is how these negotiations seems more slow. But because of it is based on consensus, so every step is prudent. From my perspective, it is the right choice.
But some of the leaders from smaller countries, I had a quote from Papua New Guinea, and they actually calling the COP meetings a complete waste of time because they think that these meetings are only coming out with empty promises and inactions. So the leader is not coming this year to Baku. I mean, why are countries like Papua New Guinea are so fierce and angry about this?
Well, I think that from developing countries' perspective, they do see there is a lack of fulfillment on the financial commitment. I think that is basically the issues, because if you look at the political compromise which was achieved in Paris, it is basically developing countries came forward with the national determined contribution with the condition that developed countries will provide finance to support the implementation of the action by developing countries. But unfortunately, that what have been seen is developing countries came with very ambitious target, right? Most of them proposed this carbon neutrality target, including China, including India, including many other developing countries. But unfortunately, we didn't see very much progress on the finance side. We only see a delay and a delay of this 100 billion, delay of the agreement on the financial commitment after 2025. So it seemed that some developing countries lost their confidence and lost their trust on this process. We see that is a bad signal, and we see that it's quite urgent at this moment that to restore those confidence on this process, how to restore. Go back to our previous discussion that developed countries should commit to a new NCQG as soon as possible.
So why aren't developed countries or rich countries delaying all their commitments and delaying the payment of $100 billion? Is it because of political reasons?
Well, after the COVID, most of the government right now are facing a very difficult financial situation, and probably it's more difficult that for some countries that to take out the money in that to invest into the climate finance in other countries. Secondly, probably that as some developed countries announced that they would like to see more donors came into this commitment, which basically they mean large developing countries such as China. They would like to see China also contribute to this target, but China do have its own position on this, and it basically regard this as an obligation imposed by the convention. So it should be obligation by developed countries. China would like to contribute to this through bilateral source climate finance channel instead of to commit within the UNFCCC channel.
China wants to contribute through a different channel instead of what the rich countries are advocating.
Yeah, because of China see the nature of those two channels are quite different. The nature of the commitment within the UNFCCC's obligation is a legally binding obligation, which has been imposed and required by the Convention and Paris Agreement. But for China, its contribution is voluntary in nature, so it should be channeled through additional bilateral source instead of that to be combined together or to be blurred together within this convention's application channel.
Under the FCC's obligation for umbrella, the developed countries are required to make those payments of $100 billion, and they have to pay it.
It's a quite interesting discussion because of one of the negotiation difficulty is how to design appropriate obligation for developed countries on that regards. That for past years they resist that to commit to a quantified target only because of this, although that they admit that this support is an obligation, but they don't admit that the 100 billion is obligation. So that if we look at the Paris Agreement, the 100 billion numbers is not in the Paris Agreement. It is in a fleet decision. There is a lot of political debate around this kind of issues, but finally, because of this negotiation, compromise, those 100 billion numbers was not inscribed within the Paris Agreement, but in a decision, which in fact make this 100 billion not as a legally binding commitment.
So it sort of gives them room or space for further negotiations probably in the future. I want to leave with the last question about everyday people, about people who are not going to be participating in decision-making for governments. How would meetings like COP29 impact on their lives or their access to energy or their costs on energy?
There is a very key concept called social cost of carbon, which means if we emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide today, what will be the total damage incurred by this carbon dioxide in the future? And this price is more than $200 at this moment, which means if we emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide, we will lose $200 in the future. And this social cost of carbon will be imposed all the populations in this world, no matter it is Chinese or it is in the United States or European Union or in other countries. The difficulty is, if we want to reduce carbon dioxide, if we want to avoid those $200 impact, we need to invest at this moment, right now. It is our generation that to pay for this mitigation. So basically, there is intergeneration equity issues. For our generation, we pay for this mitigation, but the benefit will be in the future generation. So that is basically the dilemma at this moment, whether or not we need to pay a little bit more right now, but avoid disaster future for our future generation, because of if we don't act right now, imagine that our children in the future will have to live in a world that they will suffer 6 times more heat waves compared with our generation, and 2 times more wildfires and other more intense and more dangerous extreme events.
So basically, question is, are you willing to sacrifice for your children or your grandchildren?
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Tan.
Thank you.
As I was talking to Professor Teng Fei in Beijing, over in Baku, countries reached agreement on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. It's the one about carbon markets. It sets standards for carbon trading under the United Nations. It also let countries establish bilateral carbon trading deals and link their markets. The speed of this agreement was surprising. It usually takes way longer to reach consensus at COP meetings, but it shows the urgency that's driving these negotiations. And of course, because it was fast-tracked, not everyone is thrilled. Some see this new carbon market as a loophole that might let big polluters buy offsets instead of really reducing their emissions. Others see it as a lifeline, a way to get crucial funds flowing from rich nations to those on the front lines of climate impacts. And if major players like the US back away from their commitments, the carbon market could offer some fallback support. And these days, negotiators are debating on financial goal tax, including a specific amount of money in this finance goal, the size of government finance goals, according to the proposals, could range from 100 billion to 2 trillion US dollars, and also who are responsible for the payment. For this episode, I'd like to thank Professor Teng Fei of Tsinghua University for taking the time with me. Also, thank you for sticking with me till the end of this very long episode. If you have any climate questions, you can reach me at fei.fei@cgtn.com, fei.fei@cgtn.com. I might be able to help you find the answers. If you want to know more about what's happening with our planet, subscribe to Climate Watch for more future episodes. And hold up, there are also more episodes of Greener China coming up. Until next time.